this episode of AvTalk, updates on the aviation situation in Ukraine. Plus, Airbus goes big with an A380 flying testbed for hydrogen propulsion. Hello and welcome to episode 152 of AvTalk. I am Ian Petchnick, here as always with
Jason Rabinowitz. Hello, Ian. How are you on this 152nd meeting of our voices?
I'm well. How are you, sir?
Good, thank you.
You make it's like the intro to a sporting event.
The 152nd annual.
Yeah, when teams have
recording.
been going 152nd annual, that would be something. Can you imagine having followed, like, if you had been in your late teens so if you've been born in like 1900, can you imagine having, gotten into aviation, say you lived somewhere where the Wright brothers were in the newspaper on a regular basis, and then you followed aviation, and by the time you're in your late 60s, we land a man on the moon, and then say you live into your 70s and you can fly in a 747.
That's something, all right.
That had to have been just an amazing kind of, if you were into aviation at that point and had lived that life, that would be incredible.
Yeah, we don't exactly have anything as dramatic as that, but planes are still nice.
Planes are still nice.
In our lifetime,
we'll talk
nothing,
about plenty of those.
Yeah, nothing dramatic like that has happened, but planes have gotten bigger and they've gotten smaller.
That's true. And later in the episode, they could be powered by different things. We'll get to that shortly. Let's start with an update on the situation in Ukraine. Last week, we talked about some of the airlines that were pulling back service or canceling service into and out of Ukraine. That list grew over the past week with Lufthansa Group, so Lufthansa, Swiss, and Austrian Airlines joining the list, as well as SAS and Air France. So those airlines have canceled their flights to airports other than Lviv, which is in the far western, southwestern portion of Ukraine. And those flights have continued, but we're starting to see some airports NOTAMed closed. Kharkiv is now closed overnight, the NOTAM says. This is Wednesday, February 23rd. It's closed until 6:30 in the morning UTC, so 8:30 in the morning local time. It doesn't affect any flights, but I'm not sure why you would NOTAM an airport closed if you didn't think something was going to happen. So by the time the podcast comes out on Friday morning, it could be very clear why the airport decided that they were going to close their runway overnight. I hope that's not the case.
Maybe it's just for routine maintenance, patching up some potholes or clearing off the rubber from the thresholds.
Yeah, but we'll see where that leads us. The most tracked flights all week on Flight Radar 24 have been over Ukraine. We briefly had the most tracked flight for the numerically significant Lufthansa flight Toulouse on 22/2/22. That was fun for a moment. But other than that, it's all been flights over Ukraine, especially a lot of the ISR flights by the U.S. Air Force, the Royal Air Force out of the UK, as well as some NATO aircraft. So those have been followed at this point, I want to say religiously, by a lot of people. And I'm sure that a lot of the listeners on this podcast have been following those as well. And those continue to be active as of now. So we'll see how things change by Friday. And if you're listening to the podcast on Friday, this information could all be very, very well moot, but hopefully not.
Yeah, well, as we speak right now, the number 1 and 2 most tracked flights are both the U.S. drones over Ukraine for a total, more than 101,000 people watching both of those right now. That's quite impressive. And you didn't even put out a push alert or anything. This is just
this is all
watching.
This is all people watching. Yeah.
And those are the only 2 drones we're allowed to see. I'm sure there are more up there right now that maybe not broadcasting, but there's a lot going on.
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about that for a second. We've gotten a lot of questions this week about, is this something that we should be seeing? And my answer, and the answer, is that these flights are visible because they choose to be. These aircraft are broadcasting, in the case of the two U.S. Air Force RQ-4s, they're broadcasting Mode S, not ADS-B. So we're using MLAT to track those. And we've talked about that in the past without getting into too much detail in this time around. I'll put a link in the show notes to a detailed blog post that we have if you want to learn more about that. But the short answer is that multiple receivers time how long the signal from the aircraft takes to get to that receiver, and then we're able to calculate the position of the aircraft based on how long the signal takes to get to a receiver that we know the position of. So then the latitude and longitude basically are able to be calculated for the aircraft and then displayed as the track.
Right, because these aircraft are operating at such a high altitude, I'm sure they're pinging a lot of receivers at any given time. One is operating at 51,000 feet, the other was at 54,000 feet. So there's quite good coverage on these where it naturally looks like regular ADS-B tracking.
Yeah, and the other, I guess, small thing that makes these easier to track with MLAT is that they fly slow. They're not flying Mach 0.8, 0.9. Looking at the ground speed, sometimes it's 150, 200 knots. So more akin to a decent turboprop rather than a commercial passenger aircraft. So that helps kind of make things a bit easier to track. But these are visible because they choose to be. Certainly, there are aircraft that choose not to be visible by turning off their transponder or broadcasting a signal that's not ADS-B or Mode S that we don't have the ability to track. So certainly these aircraft are announcing their presence.
I like the way that you put that. They're trackable because they choose to be trackable, as if the aircraft itself is sentient and it has turned on a switch. But it is a very intentional thing by the U.S. military. Somebody has pushed a button to make the drone transmit that. It has not decided on its own, I want to be tracked publicly.
We don't know that.
Not yet.
You don't know.
I hope not.
Now we've opened up a whole different can of worms.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So that's the current situation. As of now, roughly 350 to 400 flights a day are using Ukrainian airspace. About 300 flights in and out of Ukraine, about 50 overflights. If Ukrainian airspace is closed, those flights obviously can't access the country. The question becomes, where do the aircraft used by Ukrainian airlines go? One conversation that Jason and I were having, and that I've had with some other people, is, does the AN-225 move? Do they relocate that aircraft? It's currently at Hostomel outside Kyiv. So do they move that aircraft? And the other thing is, what happens to the aircraft by Ukrainian airlines? There are a number of routes to and from destinations between Russia and south of Ukraine, starting kind of at Turkey, which is just across the Black Sea, and then moving south to kind of some leisure destinations that non-Russian registered aircraft use. So Turkish Airlines being one of them, and some other airlines use. So those flight routes would become unavailable. And then there's also the question of what aircraft are allowed or would continue to use Ukrainian airspace by choice. So that would be kind of one of the other things that we're looking at.
Yeah, very fluid situation. Hopefully by the time this podcast comes out, nothing has changed or it has de-escalated. But stay tuned.
Yeah, unfortunately, stay tuned. Let's go a very different direction and talk about Airbus's big announcement, or I suppose I should say Airbus and CFM's big announcement this week, which was a hydrogen demonstration platform using Airbus's first A380. They will mount a CFM Passport engine on the aft fuselage of MSN 001. They will put hydrogen tanks inside the A380 and use that as a hydrogen propulsion demonstrator.
Yes, this is good. Regardless of what your opinion on hydrogen-powered aircraft is in the future, whether it's a good idea or bad or not, or even plausible, I am extremely excited to see an A380 have a experimental propulsion and engine system attached to the outside of it. It's very exciting. Gives new life to the A380 and an aircraft that had a very uncertain future. I'm very excited whether or not I think hydrogen is a plausible propulsion system for the future. I'm very excited to see what Airbus does with it.
So we've talked about aircraft that have done this before, not the hydrogen part, but mounted an engine on the fuselage before. We've talked about Honeywell's 757. We actually talked with Joe Duvall way back when. He was, I think, one of our first interviews on the podcast, a pilot of Honeywell aircraft, and he flies the Honeywell 757 on a regular basis. GE has their flying test bed, but that usually or always gets mounted on under the wing. But Rolls-Royce has their 747 that also has, and I believe it's a 747 SP that has a fuselage mounted engine mount so that they can test Rolls-Royce smaller Rolls-Royce engines. So this isn't a new concept. Using the A380 and using hydrogen,
the new concept.
However, that's the new concept. And so that's going to be I'm coming around to the idea that hydrogen is actually it's actually going to serve certainly a segment, whether or not it's the large transport segment eventually. That's going to be an interesting thing to see, and that I'm still not entirely convinced on. But the engine itself, CFM put out I want to call it a 3D rendering video, I guess, how they take, basically they take apart the engine, they show you the innards, and then they put it all back together. And it's like a 1-minute video, and they posted it on Twitter and various other places. I tell you, I watched that thing a dozen times.
Oh yeah, everything about
more than a dozen times.
Everything about this is extremely rewatchable. So Airbus says the program's objective is not to see if they can adapt the A380 to hydrogen, but it's more about to prove the effectiveness of ground and flight testing using a direct combustion engine fueled by hydrogen in preparation for Airbus's larger scheme of putting in hydrogen-powered zero-emission, air quoting there, aircraft in service by 2035. The demonstration will use this A380 equipped with liquid hydrogen tanks. There are going to be 4 towards the aft of the aircraft. The tanks themselves will be prepared at Airbus facilities in both France and Germany. So I guess plane spotters on both ends of the Airbus facilities will be able to see this. And I do believe they say this will be flying by the middle of this decade. So that could be a couple years from now. Still no real firm date on that as far as I can see. But this is really exciting. And they're using the A380 just because it's large enough to put these hydrogen tanks in. It has 4 very worthy engines to aid in the flight testing. I guess it can really not be that affected by bolting on this test engine to the outside, but this is very exciting stuff.
So 2 things here. One, I think the A380 is a fascinating thing. I mean, of course, it'll be affected somehow, but I'm sure they'll compensate for it. I mean, if they can do it to a 757, why not an A380? But the difference when looking at the renderings, and we'll put a link to the renderings and all that good fun stuff in the show notes so that everyone can kind of follow along visually with what we're talking about. But they're mounting it to the aft fuselage, which is all 2 other aircraft that I know about. And if I'm missing one, let me know at podcast@fr24.com if I'm missing any of the engine test beds where they've mounted an engine to the side of the fuselage. But the other 2, the 757 and the Rolls-Royce 747, they have the engine mounted on the forward fuselage ahead of the wing. So the Passport engine is not huge. It's CFM's
comparatively tiny.
Yeah, I mean, compared to the Trent 900s that it's got on it, it's used for, let's see, it's up to 20,000 pounds of thrust. It's a business jet engine, and I'm trying to grab real quick to see which aircraft it's been fitted to. That's a really good question. Because
why do I feel like the Honda jet comes to mind?
That could be. But one of the interesting things is the engine itself is not that large. So we're not talking about this huge engine. We're talking about something that's much smaller, powered the Global 7500, the Bombardier long-range business jet. So it's not huge, but it's also not tiny.
But Airbus has provided some information about why they have put the engine at the rear of the aircraft. And I quote, "It will be mounted along the rear fuselage of the flying testbed to allow engine emissions, including contrails, to be monitored separately from those of the engines powering the aircraft." You would think that putting it forward of the existing engines would make that easier, but I'm sure Airbus and GE know what they're doing.
Well, so that is interesting. I saw that mentioned and then had promptly forgot about it. But thank you for bringing that up again. That'll be really interesting to see what they do. I don't have official information on this, but what I'm assuming they will do is fly the DLR sniffer plane behind it, which is the German Aerospace Research Engineering Lab. And they have an aircraft that is set up to basically sniff another airplane's exhaust and fly close enough where they can get readings. We talked about this, I don't know, maybe 100 episodes ago when NASA's DC-8 was in Europe and they were doing these follow-on tests. They were flying one after the other and the DLR plane was flying around. So that'll be interesting to see. And I mean, we're talking about the promise of zero emissions. Hopefully that they're like, oh yeah, zero emissions, great, done.
Yeah, again, this really puts to test the engine itself and the emissions. It doesn't really seek to answer questions about the actual production of hydrogen, or I guess it will, the storage of hydrogen. But there's still a lot of unanswered questions about the actual sustainability of hydrogen, the production of hydrogen. But this is obviously a very large piece of the puzzle.
In September, when we were in Toulouse, Airbus said by 2035, we're going to fly a hydrogen-powered aircraft. And they seemed very earnest that that was their timeline. Does that timeline falter? Probably, as with any aerospace undertaking. But it's good to see that they're going to have something in the air, at least testing the beginnings of something in a couple years. But I tell you what, I want to see this thing fly.
Oh, absolutely. If anyone at Airbus is listening, I would very much like to be there when this thing takes off for the first time.
yeah, exactly. So we both did a little TV watching over the weekend, beginning of the week. And we got someone wrote us on Twitter and said, hey, what did you guys think of Downfall, the Netflix documentary on the 737 MAX? And Jason, you watched over the weekend. I watched it last night. What did you think of it, sir?
I mean, honestly, there's not much new information that I gained from watching this documentary, except for, a renewed feeling of just anger that this was allowed to happen and that no one has really faced any legitimate consequences. And we're not exactly in the same position where we were with the issues at Boeing, but we have not come nearly as far as we probably all would have hoped. But for anyone who maybe isn't super into this industry and doesn't know all of the nitty-gritty detail of what happened with the MAX, it is a very eye-opening look, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think I'm in a very similar a very similar vein. I think that if you've been a longtime listener to the podcast, if you've been following this from the beginning, there weren't any real surprises. It lays everything out, I think, in a very straightforward manner. I thought it was well done, the crafting of the story, the way they did it. That said, if you haven't been following it, or if if you recently started listening to the podcast, the way it is portrayed and the information that comes out, I think is certainly eye-opening. And like Jason, I came away with a renewed sense of anger. One of the things that I thought it did well, though, was lay out the kind of the cultural push that took place in Boeing after the McDonnell-Douglas merger, or kind of at the genesis of the McDonnell-Douglas merger, and as Boeing turned into basically what McDonnell-Douglas was. The long and the short of it is that Boeing was an engineering first company and then became a financial company that happened to do engineering. And this was kind of the gist of Peter Robinson's book, Flying Blind, along the similar lines, but it gets into the book gets into much more detail, obviously, because it's longer than a film, that, how that all occurred. But I thought they laid it out quite well.
Yeah, that's a good point, that the documentary isn't just solely about the MAX. It's about the decades-long story that ended up with the tragedy of the MAX and the subsequent grounding. That, the how the corporate culture went from engineering first, do the right thing, if there's an issue, go fix it, to basically how do we appease Wall Street and eke out the highest level of dividends to our shareholders above and beyond anything. And really, more than anything else, it's really kind of an indictment on our economy as a whole, just really maximizing profits more than anything else. And I've talked with some other people, and I think that's really why nobody has faced legitimate consequences from this. Because if you prosecute somebody at Boeing over what has happened with these crashes, you're kind of indicting the entire American economy, because every company is doing what's best for their bottom line at the end of the day. So I don't know. Again, the whole thing just kind of made me angry all over again.
Yeah, but I think one of the other takeaways here is kind of knowing what we know now about what's happening at the FAA, seeing the FAA with a renewed sense of regulatory authority, especially after the law that Congress, and part of the documentary follows the hearings that were held in Congress that culminated in the aviation law that was passed by Congress, basically reinforcing and strengthening the FAA's oversight. Now that pendulum of Boeing walking all over the FAA has swung very much in a different direction, where the FAA is saying, no, we are not going to certify these things. That what we talked about last week with the FAA saying that they will retain certification on each and every 787 that rolls out moving forward once they are allowed to fly again. So I think that's something that the documentary, of course, stops before we get to that part. But that's kind of the follow. If you were going to make a sequel, I think you would have to make it about the FAA, its role in the 737 MAX, but then also what it's doing now.
Yeah. So if you have Netflix, go ahead and watch it if the topic interests you. But just mad all over again.
Just mad all over again. Sticking with the FAA Administrator Steve Dickson is retiring. He's leaving the FAA 2.5 years into his 5-year term as FAA Administrator. He is leaving, quote unquote, to spend more time with his family.
Yeah. I remember some people had asked him in the wake of that, did the Biden administration ask him to leave because of, in part, the whole C-band fiasco, the 5G nonsense that's still going on? And he said, reportedly, no, they actually asked me to stay. So who knows what the real deal is, but he says he wants to spend more time with his family, so be it.
I mean, after everything that's happened, I would want to spend more time with his family, too.
Yeah, sure.
I would want to spend more time with my family. Maybe not necessarily more time with his family.
Kind of a real pivotal wow, I can't get that word out, but pivotal, there it is, moment in the FAA's, history for the administrator to be leaving, since his job is not done. The administration is not really in a much better position than it was several years ago. It's on the way, but there's still a very large mountain to climb up before that can be considered a done job. But who's next?
Well, I mean, I guess that's the big question is who's next. Dickson came up through, he was and still is a pilot. Then he was at Delta, and then he came up through the FAA and then became administrator. And so now I guess the question becomes, do you keep with that kind of mold, someone who has deep aviation experience? Do you go with someone who has regulatory experience in another area to be administrator? I think that's an interesting thing that the Biden administration is going to have to answer.
Well, I don't imagine they're going to appoint anyone in the immediate future, but we'll keep an eye on it.
They may have bigger concerns at the moment, but yeah, it'll be interesting to see who they choose. The scope clause strikes again, my friend.
Oh no! What's joining the Mitsubishi MRJ space jet in the graveyard of planes that will never be built?
The E175 E2.
Oh, I love the
I know.
E175.
Who doesn't? It's a great plane.
It is.
It's comfortable. It's sporty. It's fun.
No middle seats. What's there not
No
to
middle
like?
seats.
But it is not dead. It is not going to join the MRJ in the graveyard of planes, of misfit airplanes that will never fly. But it probably is. I mean, they said they're going to delay it, what, till 2030 or something?
Yeah, I mean, if they build it, something big has changed.
Yes.
In how pilot contracts are structured to allow for that, but it's probably not going to happen.
No, that's disappointing. But the interesting is there are so many E175s operating in North America. Eventually, they will need to be replaced. But I guess at this point, many of them are still well within their lifespan. They're still pumping out the E1, so it's probably a good decision to pause the E2, and maybe by the time it's really needed, we'll be on the E175 E3.
Ooh.
Hydrogen propulsion, maybe.
Well, the H1, I was going to say, they'll probably be on the E175 H1.
Well, Embraer did put out those, remember, from a few weeks or months
ago. Yeah,
ago.
they have pretty pictures.
Yeah, pretty pictures of saying these are completely hypothetical, but maybe they become the E3.
Well, but they've also partnered with Widerøe, and I forget what the engine manufacturer was on this, but for an electric aircraft. So that's,
to be fair, who hasn't?
Well, I mean, this would be an electric aircraft with an actual purpose. Thinking along the lines of the ES-19, where you would have a small, basically it's a -8 replacement for airlines like Widerøe, which are flying these EAS routes.
Surely, once again, I'm going to mention them again, to be operated by Mesa.
Fair enough. Let's see. What else do we have in the regulatory area? Oh, we have South Korea saying yes to the Korean Air Asiana merger provisionally. They haven't given the A-OK. They've given the okay.
Okay, now they got to figure out what do we need to extort from this combined airline to make it palatable to the competition.
Exactly. So that'll be something to keep an eye on. But they didn't say no, and that's the important thing.
That is important. I don't think that was ever going to happen at this point. This is a merger that seems like it really does need to happen. And it is a country where there is significant low-cost airline competition. So we'll see what they have to give up. I can't imagine it's all that much, but the two combined have plenty to give.
Yeah, exactly. Also with plenty to give was Sir Tim Clark.
Oh boy, this was a fun interview.
Who continues to speak his mind, and hopefully he can come on the podcast and speak his mind.
That would be great. Remind me, where did this interview come from?
We're going to work on that one. Let's see. This was published in Airliner Ratings, I believe.
Yes,
originally, but I'm not sure where it originally. It was published in Airliner. I'm not sure if that was the original reason for the interview or not, but it comes from Andreas Spaeth.
Yeah, so the gist of it is, as a reminder, Tim Clark is the soon-to-be retiring president of Emirates, who has nothing left to lose at this point. He has been extremely vocal about anything and everything you ask him at this point, basically. He had lots of jabs to throw at Boeing and Airbus. He was sympathetic to Qatar's issues with the A350s, which is really, I think, the first time we've seen another airline executive even acknowledge that the problem is a thing. But also that due to the obvious delays with the 777X delivery that nobody expects Boeing to actually deliver when they say it's going to deliver, they have had to look at extending the life of their existing aircraft, since there's really nothing out there that comes close to the size of the 777X or the A380. So they will have to extend the life of, getting this from the article, about 120 aircraft, 80 of them the A380 plus 40 or 50 777-300ERs. That is interesting that we will see the A380s given some new life to last maybe up to more than 15 years through the mid-2030s. Kind of unexpected, as other airlines are really going out of their way to get rid of that aircraft.
Yeah, I mean, their model is so
unique
that I don't want to say that, to say that the normal laws of supply and demand don't apply, but they kind of don't.
It's almost an endless pit of demand. So they need the airplanes.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, his really interesting, I thought the most interesting part of the interview was his comments about the 777-9 delivery schedule, which is basically Boeing. He says Boeing told them that once you get the initial batch, we can't really give you any more because of the production problem, or not production problem, but production program. And Clark says, but we need our airplanes. So that's going to be an interesting thing to see how quickly Emirates can get the 777-9. And then, like you mentioned, his comments about the A350 paint issue with Emirates eventually down the production line for the A350, Clark basically saying, hey, fix the problem or we're not taking the planes.
Yeah, if this is still a problem when
whatever the problem
aircraft,
is,
we will not be taking
done.
those aircraft. And on the 777-9 or the 777X, also interesting that Boeing has apparently also already produced 12 of those aircraft for Emirates, and they are in storage without the engines on. And because of the certification and remedial work, they don't know when they're going to get those aircraft. And of course, the line is that they're not due to be certified until July 2023. And if lucky, they'll get them 6 months to a year later. And if it's delayed too much longer, Tim Clark basically said, you can keep your aircraft. We won't need them by then.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of crazy to me that through all of that, they would just be done with it. The other kind of, it seemed like a throwaway line too, but where he mentions the 787 having the same paint problem.
To a lesser degree.
Yeah, the 787, and I'll quote from the interview, the 787 also has the same kind of problem, but not as bad. For example, on the wings at Etihad. So that's interesting to me because I hadn't seen that before. Had you?
No, but you can be sure I'm going to go take a look at that now.
Yeah. I mean, that'll be a very interesting thing to see if there's a follow-up on.
None of Etihad's 787s are particularly old. The average age of their Dash 9s is only 4.6 years, so they're not that old. But much like Qatar, these aircraft are flying constantly in and out of extreme heat, probably flying to much colder places. So I guess it would make sense if these aircraft, the composite aircrafts, are having the same issues as the A350, but apparently to a lesser degree.
Yeah.
You know, it's funny. I'm trying to find a picture of the upper part of the wings of a 787, but these damn things have so much wing flex anytime they're on the move.
You can
can't
only see
the top
the
of
bottom.
Wings.
You'll have to look for one kind of like a banking. So look for departures from New York and London. Those are where you get good bank shots of departures. Air Canada wants its extra A220s after all. So they had canceled an order for A220s. They said, no, we don't need them. And now this week they say, can we have our spot back, please?
I wonder how much they're going to have to pay to get their spot back, or how that even works. Because typically...
I have no idea.
Yeah, typically, especially in aircraft like the 220 with demand and not all that high production numbers, doesn't someone else usually slot in real quick to grab that spot? And
I mean, if I was somebody else, I would.
Yeah, I don't know. Good for Air Canada, though. It's a great looking aircraft in their livery.
It is. I mean, I haven't seen a bad looking. I take that back. The original C-Series house livery, I was not a fan of. It made the airplane look old.
I'm turning around to look at my model of it, and yeah, it's kind of like dotted in the back, and then it's just got the kind of ugly CS100 text on the tail. Yeah, it wasn't the greatest looking, for sure.
No, it made it look old. But when you put it in an actual airline livery, it looks sleek, it looks new, it looks like, yeah, that's a great airplane.
Yep, indeed it is.
So a few things before we go. One is that, and this goes back to, we'll tie this into the little interview portion that Tim Clark gave, where he closes the interview by saying how that deals with the high court case, I have no idea. That was Tim Clark talking about the paint issues. The other thing that happened this week as far as the court case goes is that the court told Airbus to hold off on the A321neo order cancellation. So as part of all of this dealing, Airbus had canceled Qatar's order for 50 A321neo aircraft. This week, the court said, hold on, let's figure this out.
Everybody take a deep breath.
and hold off on making that cancellation final. Because Qatar Airways has said, well, you can't cancel our order. And Airbus has said, absolutely we can. And so now they're going to go back into court and they're going to talk about who's right, who's wrong, and the court will decide whether or not they can actually cancel the order or not. That'll be an interesting thing to see if the court says, no, you can't cancel the order. And then does they build the planes and Qatar takes them? I guess
they'd probably lease them out and they would never wear Qatar livery. But this has got to be the strangest court case in which a manufacturer is saying, no, we don't want to sell to you. And we're going to go to court to make sure we don't have to sell to you. It's just a bizarre situation.
And eventually we'll get to the point where everybody takes a big step back. They settle this somehow. And then Qatar, in X number of years, buys Y number of planes for Z billions of dollars.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
The Joby prototype suffered a crash last week. That's pretty much all we know.
Yeah, that's the eVTOL aircraft that's been testing out in California, I think north of San Francisco, maybe. They filed, and I believe it was an 8K with the SEC very, very quietly that, hey, we experienced a crash. Nobody was hurt. The end. We don't know anything else about what happened. Very, very actually impressed that there has not been a single leak that I have seen of the extent of the aircraft. We know there was no injuries, thankfully. It was not a piloted aircraft, or it was remotely piloted, at least, or maybe autonomously. I don't really know. But all we know is that the aircraft crashed, and that could mean, who knows, maybe it had a traumatic crash and exploded into a million pieces, or maybe the landing gear broke a little bit. We just don't know.
Yeah, but the NTSB is investigating.
Yes, but these things happen in flight test programs. It was allegedly in a stage of flight testing where they were pushing it beyond its design specifications, as you typically do in flight worthiness testing. But we just don't know. I don't love the level of transparency here, because when Airbus or Boeing are flight testing a new aircraft, we see pretty much everything, and they make a pretty big deal about it. But in this case, we still don't know anything. So stay tuned.
Yeah, we know next to nothing. So let's close the show. This is an interesting one, and I'm keen to hear everyone's thoughts on this one as well. The UK's Institute of Economic Affairs is a think tank that came out with a study called The Future of Transport After COVID-19. And what they did is they looked at how the pandemic impacted aviation, how transport consumers purchase or use various modes of transport, including aviation. And they basically argue that instead of propping up airlines, instead of making aid packages available to airlines, they should have just let all of the airlines that were going to fail.
Oh,
and been done with it.
That's a hell of a hot take. No. No, this is stupid. This is extremely stupid. I'm not going to say what I'm thinking really here, but this is one of the most monumentally stupid, boneheaded studies could possibly release. Why would you put your name on this? First of all, you kind of needed the airlines out there in business to distribute the very thing that was hopefully going to end the pandemic, which would be the vaccine. Really hard to distribute those without airplanes. And if you think airlines around the world are struggling to keep up with demand and stay operationally sound right now, and they are, can you imagine starting from scratch? No, because that's absurd.
So, quote, notwithstanding the negative impact on employees, shareholders, suppliers, and so on, a natural, quote unquote, natural collapse of the aviation sector might have helped to contain the pandemic, end quote. A couple things here. And so on is doing a lot of heavy lifting there.
Heavy lifting there. No. So what would happen there if the airlines just went out of business and said, sorry, we're gone? What do you do with those airplanes? Or the highly trained staff that operates and crews the aircraft themselves, or the dispatchers, or the people who run the airports? None of this makes any sense. If you just don't pay attention to all of the extremely negative aspects, maybe things would have been okay, probably. That was the study.
Yeah, their argument is that if you let all these airlines fail, the virus may have spread more slowly.
Okay, but spreading more slowly doesn't stop it. They would have kept operating until a point where they would have just run out of money and got a bit out of business. But at that point, the damage is already done. You've got nothing.
I'm just telling you what the study. So we'll put a link in the show notes to the study if you want some light reading. Well, I mean, the summary is not terribly lengthy, but the report itself is not short. But it'll be interesting to hear what everyone else has to say about this. There's some handy charts and graphs, so maybe you'll find that interesting.
Yeah. Imagine if just one day British Airways disappeared, had to start from scratch, or somebody else would have to start from scratch. What would that even look like?
I don't know. Let's leave it there.
Okay.
Before we say any more, we'll call this episode done.
I'm going to go to bed.
That's a great idea. This has been episode 152 of AvTalk. I am Ian Petchnick, here as always with
Jason Rabinowitz. Thanks for listening.